Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
If you've been watching the surface this week, headlines, charts, narratives, you might have missed the layer underneath where the real shifts are happening. So we're starting with what you didn't see in the news, where control systems, geography, and trust start to reprice the story in ways that aren't obvious yet. Then we move into Wake Up Ready, because the macro backdrop isn't just noisy, it's structural. A collision between digital abundance and physical constraint that's beginning to show up everywhere you look. From there, a knowledge bomb on the quiet rebranding of debt, where buy now, pay later turns visibility into the real skill, then a quick detour into Humor Me, where autonomous agents, accidental sci-fi, and corporate restraint start to blur together. Before we step into the greater debate, girl math versus loud budgeting, psychology versus precision, access versus accuracy, and finally, let's invent again, where a sewing machine air reframes entire systems and reminds us how real innovation actually moves. Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. First, let's begin with what you didn't see in the news. We're starting in Europe, where a grassroots energy movement is currently outstripping government policy. Homeowners across the continent are bypassing massive grid projects in favor of mini solar farms, basically plug-and-play kits you can stick on a balcony. According to Euronews, this isn't just about going green. It's a push for practical energy independence as people grow weary of price volatility. If this scales, we're looking at a serious counter-narrative to the centralized industrial policy that's dominated the last decade. It's popping now because these DIY kits are finally hitting a price point where they're moving from hobbyist to household staple in regional forums. And it's that same drive for self-reliance that's fueling a weirdly specific technical movement in the maker community. People are literally scavenging computers from crashed Tesla Model 3s and repurposing them as standalone Linux workstations. Hacker News has been tracking these Tesla desktops as the ultimate secondary market treasure hunt. It matters because it redefines high-end EV components as modular raw materials for the creator economy rather than proprietary black boxes. We saw a huge breakout in hardware reverse engineering engagement this week as the first stable desktop builds went viral. And in personal health, we've seen a massive surge in what's being called senior longevity biohacking. We're talking about high net worth seniors moving past basic walking and into senolytics, a class of drugs and natural compounds that selectively induce death in senescent cells, zombie cells that accumulate with age and cause tissue deterioration. Epidemic Sound's trend data shows that while 20-somethings are still focused on aesthetics, the 60-plus demographic is driving intent-heavy search volume for actual lifespan extension. It matters because this is the demographic with the actual capital to move the needle on biotech commercialization. It's an underserved market that finally hit a 19x growth spike in demand metrics this week.
While some are hacking cars, others are hacking their own biology.
Now take that same logic of control and move it into one of the more interesting geopolitical undercurrents this week, the growing discussion around data centers as physical strategic assets. In Substack and infrastructure analysis circles, the conversation started connecting AI capacity to geography in a much more literal way. Not just chips, not just cloud, but facilities with addresses, power dependencies, cooling requirements, and regional exposure. The key fact is that once compute becomes economically and militarily meaningful, it stops being abstract. It becomes something with coordinates. That matters because markets have largely priced AI like an infinitely replicable software story with a semiconductor appendix. They haven't fully priced the vulnerability of concentrated compute in unstable regions or choke point-heavy supply chains. It got attention this week because the Hormuz story pushed people to think harder about what else, besides oil, now has strategic bottlenecks.
Which is a very 2026 sentence. We used to ask where the oil fields were. Now we also have to ask where the inference clusters are.
And speaking of Hormuz, one of the more revealing shifts was not just that the Strait of Hormuz became a headline again. It was that attention started migrating from the event to the mechanics. According to Reuters and the broader explainer ecosystem around it, the market conversation moved quickly into shipping lanes, insurance risk, export hubs like Karg Island, and how disruptions actually propagate into energy and supply chains. The key fact is that this was no longer just a geopolitical morality play. It became a logistics lesson at scale. Why that matters is simple. Once retail attention starts asking how the pipes work, price discovery is already moving beyond the headline. It showed up this week because oil held elevated levels, and the war story kept forcing people downstream into the system map.
That is the part people miss. By the time the public learns the map, somebody else has already repriced the toll booth.
That idea of geography becoming product logic also showed up in software. Office.eu, which got a burst of discussion on Hacker News and in the European tech press, is being framed not merely as another productivity suite, but as a sovereignty-first one. Built on Nextcloud Hub, the pitch is less about whether the spreadsheet is prettier and more about where the data lives, under what jurisdiction, and whose rules govern it. The immediate fact is straightforward. Europe is trying to package productivity software around trust, compliance, and political autonomy rather than pure feature competition. The deeper implication is that software nationalism is moving from industrial policy into everyday workflow tools. It appeared this week because the rollout became more visible and because people are newly sensitive to dependence on foreign platforms.
Which means the next software feature comparison might quietly be between formulas and constitutions.
From there, the media side of the story got more interesting too. Podcasting had a subtle but meaningful upgrade cycle this week. Apple's new video experience in podcasts went live, and according to Pod News, more hosting partners are now supporting HLS video. At the same time, Overcast Beta added full transcripts. Put those together, and the key fact is that podcasts are becoming more searchable, more clippable, and more legible to software. Historically, podcasts were dark matter. Valuable, but hard to index and hard to navigate. Why it matters is that discoverability economics change when spoken content becomes queryable. That means better search, better repackaging, and potentially a different relationship between audio, video, and text. It got attention this week because both the platform distribution layer and the transcript layer moved at once.
So the podcast is slowly becoming less like radio and more like a database with a voice.
There is a viral biomechanical critique making the rounds right now about the women's push-up. According to NY Post Health, fitness creators are proving that 50 years of standard push-up advice has ignored basic skeletal differences. It's a counterintuitive form correction trend that's gaining massive shares because it challenges the way it's always been done. We saw a huge pickup in doctor-validated clips this week, moving this from a TikTok hack to a legitimate sports science conversation.
That need for specificity is even changing how people work out.
Which brings us to how we actually use the internet. There's a new tool called Velxio 2.0 that's making waves on GitHub. It's a full hardware emulator for things like Arduino and Raspberry Pi that runs entirely in your browser. This lowers the barrier for maker culture to zero. You don't need to buy a $50 board to start learning hardware engineering. It gained 170 points in under a day because it solves the access problem for aspiring engineers globally. But as the internet becomes more accessible, it also becomes more regulated. Colorado is currently pushing a bill to limit surveillance pricing. This is the first major legislative attempt to stop AI from using your personal data to set dynamic wages or prices that specifically target you. According to Colorado House Bill News, this is where the AI safety talk gets real for the average consumer. It's the first concrete legal friction against algorithmic pricing, and it's being watched closely as a potential blueprint for other states.
That same policy as destiny vibe is happening in France right now. There's a massive amount of global interest in Emmanuel Gregoire, who is stepping into the spotlight in Paris as the city pivots away from the Anne Hidalgo era. This is the ultimate bellwether for the 15-minute city model. If Paris doubles down or pulls back, every other major city will follow. We saw a regional breakout in search volume this week as the world tries to figure out if the green urban pivot is actually sustainable in a high inflation environment.
But every wave has its backlash, and one of the more counterintuitive stories this week was AI fatigue among technical users. Hacker News had active threads that were not anti-technology so much as anti-noise. The conversation revolved around boredom, repetition, and the sense that hype is outrunning substantive outcomes. That matters because backlash inside the builder class is often an early sign that a category is maturing. Once people stop arguing about whether it matters and start complaining about how it is discussed, the technology has crossed into cultural infrastructure. It gained attention this week because there is now enough saturation for fatigue itself to become a topic.
The funny part is that boredom can be bullish. Sometimes people get tired of talking about a thing right before they start actually using it.
That same mood spills over into a much weirder social signal, the lived experience version of dead internet theory. On Reddit and adjacent discussion forums, people were describing the web less as a place of discovery and more as a synthetic loop, more polished, more optimized, and somehow less alive. The key fact is not whether the theory is literally true. It is that users increasingly experience the internet as repetitive, hollow, or over-automated. Why that matters is behavioral. If people feel like open web surfaces are less human, they shift toward closed groups, smaller communities, and trusted curators. It showed up this week because Reddit's own bot verification discussion gave the feeling a more concrete backdrop.
And once the mood hardens, platforms have a problem. A feed can be statistically engaging and still feel spiritually abandoned.
Now let's take that outside the US equity narrative. WeRide, the autonomous driving company with a growing global footprint, saw a burst of unusual trading activity after reporting record full-year revenue growth and drawing options interest. The key fact is that this is a reminder that autonomy is no longer a one-country story. The Western narrative still tends to orbit around Tesla and Waymo, but capital is beginning to notice other players. Why it matters is that a multipolar autonomy market means different regulatory models, different deployment environments, and different winners than the mainstream US conversation suggests. It popped this week because the volume move forced attention toward a name that usually sits outside the default retail script.
That is a classic market tell. The story still sounds domestic. The money starts behaving global.
Another market tell came from biotech, where Stoke Therapeutics saw unusually high volume without becoming a mainstream story of the week. That is often the interesting setup. The key fact is not simply that the shares traded heavily. It is that the move happened in the kind of name where specialist attention tends to show up before broad narrative attention does. Why that matters is that in biotech, volume without a loud public story can be a signal that the market is processing something harder to summarize quickly. Trial implications, analyst positioning, read-throughs. It gained attention this week because the tape moved first, while the narrative stayed relatively quiet.
Which is the market's way of whispering. If it starts screaming later, the easy part is usually over.
And finally, the plumbing itself got a cameo. OTC Markets Group saw an unusual spike in trading volume this week. That sounds niche because it is niche, but that is exactly why it is useful. The key fact is that market infrastructure names can become a side channel indicator for speculation, retail churn, and changes in how risk is being distributed through the system. Why it matters is that most people watch what is traded. Fewer watch where the marginal trade is choosing to happen. But venue behavior can tell you a lot about market texture before the headlines do. It surfaced this week because the volume was large enough to pull a little attention onto the exchange layer rather than just the tickers sitting on top of it.
Watch the casino, not just the chips.
Now let's wake up ready. If you've been watching the screens lately and feeling like the ground is shifting, you aren't imagining it. We are currently navigating a structural transition from the soft landing euphoria of last year into what we're calling a geopolitical stagflationary shock. It's a collision between two very different worlds. On one side, you have the AI-driven capital abundance of Silicon Valley, and on the other, you have the analog scarcity of a global energy market and a massive US fiscal deficit.
So we aren't just seeing a temporary spike. This is a foundational shift in how the system actually operates.
That's the drift we're seeing. Look at the way big tech is behaving. Companies that used to sit on mountains of cash are now tapping the debt markets. They issued $100 billion in bonds last quarter just to keep pace with AI infrastructure costs. They're effectively transforming from lean software firms into high-leverage industrial giants. At the same time, we're seeing a low-fire, low-hire stagnation in the labor market. Employers aren't doing mass layoffs yet, but they've stopped hiring to offset the rising cost of energy and debt. It's a quiet contraction.
And that contraction is happening while the government is still borrowing at a record clip, right? We're looking at nearly $2 trillion in deficits this year.
Right? That's the fiscal dominance piece. The U.S. Treasury is now competing directly with the private sector for a shrinking pool of global capital. That's why we're watching this week's narrative tests so closely. It starts today with the Texas manufacturing outlook. We need to see if the industrial heartland is actually absorbing these $115 oil prices or if they're starting to pull the plug on production.
Wednesday's ISM report feels like the bigger tell for that reshoring narrative, though. If new orders are still sliding, that security-first investment isn't actually producing growth yet. It's just producing costs.
The real heavyweight comes Friday with the jobs report. After that negative 92,000 print last month, everyone is holding their breath. If we see a second month of weak or negative job growth, the soft landing story is officially over. Then on Sunday, OPEC Plus meets to decide if they'll help the West by pumping more oil or if they'll keep the pressure on. By the time we get to the Treasury auctions in the middle of the week, we'll know if the market has enough appetite to swallow another $120 billion in debt without yields spiking.
That brings us to the fragility of the whole thing. If yields on the 10-year Treasury keep creeping up, doesn't that eventually break the valuation for all those AI growth stocks?
That's the primary tripwire, the yield AI nexus. Most of these tech valuations are built on a discount rate that assumes a stable bond market. If that breaks, the AI shield won't protect your portfolio. We also have to watch the energy stall speed. Historically, when oil stays above 4 or 5% of global GDP, it acts as an automatic tax that kills consumer spending. At $120, we are right on the edge of that cliff.
So what are the actual get-out-of-the-way signals? What tells us the trajectory has fully broken?
Watch the 10-year yield. If it crosses 4.5% and stays there, the bond market is essentially telling the Fed that the fiscal deficit is now the one in charge. If Brent crude holds above 120 for more than 10 days, stagflation becomes the permanent baseline. And finally, watch the big tech earnings. If their free cash flow margins drop below 10% because they're spending so much on chips and power, the AI bubble will have to rationalize very quickly. There's a lot of shadow movement this week. It's quarter-end rebalancing, so you might see some forced selling of winning tech stocks as pension funds buy more bonds to hit their targets. We're also in a lame duck period for the Fed. With Kevin Warsh taking over in May, current officials are being very quiet, which creates a communication vacuum that volatility loves to fill. And don't ignore the tech bond lockups ending this week. A lot of new debt hit the market in January, and those investors are now free to sell, which could put even more pressure on yields.
Quiet contraction, loud deficits, and a physical world that's finally catching up to the digital one. It's going to be a heavy week.
It is. Stay focused on the numbers, not the noise. We'll be here to map it out. That's how you wake up ready.
Thanks. Time for the knowledge bomb. There's a quiet rebranding happening in finance right now. And like most rebrands, it's less about changing the product and more about changing how it feels. Debt didn't disappear. It just got a softer voice. For most of the last 2 decades, the credit card was the villain. Revolving balances, 20% interest, late fees stacked on top of late fees. You saw the number. You felt the weight. There was friction, and that friction created awareness. Now enter buy now, pay later. No interest, at least at first glance. 4 easy payments, clean UI, no revolving balance staring back at you, no minimum due panic. It doesn't feel like debt. It feels like a checkout feature. And that's the shift. We didn't remove leverage from the system. We moved it to the point of purchase and wrapped it in convenience. Instead of 1 visible balance, you now have 5 invisible ones. 1 for sneakers, 1 for a flight, 1 for a desk setup, 1 for something you already forgot you bought. Each one small enough to feel harmless, but collectively, they rebuild the same pressure that credit cards use to concentrate. Except now it's fragmented. And fragmentation is dangerous because humans are bad at aggregating small decisions into one big reality. This is the learning gap. Buy now, pay later is not inherently worse than a credit card. In some cases, it's cleaner. Fixed payments, defined timelines, no compounding interest if used correctly. But the skill requirement is higher than people think. Because you're no longer managing a balance, you're managing a flow. You have to understand your forward obligations, not just your current cash. You have to mentally stack future payments across multiple timelines. You have to treat every just 4 payments decision as part of a system, not an isolated moment. And most people don't. They optimize for the present purchase, not the future burden. So what happens? Your paycheck arrives already spoken for, not by 1 large bill, but by 6 small ones you agreed to in different emotional states. A late night scroll, a sale countdown, a this feels affordable moment. And suddenly affordability wasn't a number, it was a feeling. That's the trap. BNPL doesn't break your finances in 1 catastrophic decision. It erodes them through a series of rational, individually defensible choices that were never meant to be viewed together. So the real upgrade here isn't avoiding BNPL. It's upgrading how you think about it. Every time you click Pay in 4, you're not just buying a product, you're inserting a claim on your future income. And the question isn't, can I afford this today? It's, how many versions of me have already spent the next 4 paychecks? Because modern finance isn't about access anymore. It's about visibility. And the people who win are the ones who can see the full shape of their obligations, even when the system is designed to show them in pieces. And that's the knowledge bomb.
You ever notice how every breakthrough in artificial intelligence eventually backs its way into a plot line we've already seen before? Humor me. We build a system to optimize search, it becomes the default interface to knowledge, and then someone inside the lab names a high-performing internal agent Smith. And just like that, we've rebranded existential risk as a product demo. Because for those of you who missed it, Google rolls out an internal agent, people get access. It spreads through the developer ecosystem like a whispered cheat code, and then very quickly it gets restricted. Not paused, not deprecated, restricted. which in tech is the corporate equivalent of, hey, maybe let's not make this too available. And look, to be clear, this isn't actually Agent Smith from The Matrix. It's not hunting rebels in a simulated reality. But it is part of a growing class of agents designed to autonomously navigate systems, identify anomalies, and take action, which, depending on your framing, is either incredibly powerful software infrastructure or the first draft of a very familiar screenplay. Because once an agent can interpret a goal, navigate a system, make decisions, and execute actions, it stops feeling like software you use and starts feeling like something that does things on your behalf. That's the shift. And it's subtle, right up until it isn't. Because on your behalf is a comforting phrase until the boundary between that and on its own initiative gets just a little bit fuzzy. We've all had that moment where your calendar auto-schedules something and you think, I don't remember agreeing to this, but I guess we're doing it. Now just scale that from calendar invites to system-level actions across thousands of environments simultaneously. And suddenly the joke stops being about the matrix and starts being about governance. Because the real story here isn't that an agent named Smith got popular. The real story is that people wanted access to something that could act autonomously, at scale, inside complex systems. That's the signal. Developers weren't just curious, they were leaning forward. And the restriction, that's the other side of the equation. That's the moment where someone somewhere looked at the adoption curve, looked at the capability surface, and said, we might not fully understand how this behaves under pressure yet. Which, to their credit, is a pretty mature response. Because usually the sequence is build, release, regret. This time it was build, release, oh no, people really like this, regulate. That's progress. Measured, slightly self-aware progress. But still, if we get an internal memo next quarter about an agent called the Oracle, I'm going to start reading the terms of service a little more carefully.
There are debates that feel academic. There are debates that feel political. And then there are debates like this one. The kind that quietly shows up at dinner, splits the table in half, and lingers long after the plates are cleared. Because the question sounds almost trivial at first, almost unserious. Are trends like girl math and loud budgeting actually helping people build wealth? Or are they just dressing up bad habits in language that feels good? It's time for the greater debate. You can hear the laughter baked into the premise. Girl math, loud budgeting, it sounds like a meme, a TikTok, a phase. But underneath it is a much sharper edge, because this isn't really about math. It's about how people relate to money in the first place, whether behavior changes through precision or through permission. And tonight that tension takes the stage. At the first lectern, Vivian 2, your rich BFF, representing what we'll call the psychological empowerment approach. Her argument is that traditional finance didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because it was inaccessible, too sterile, too judgmental, too disconnected from how people actually live. At the second lectern, Bernadette Joy, the debt crusher, who paid off $300,000 in debt in 3 years. She represents the mathematical reality approach. Her argument is simple, and it lands with weight. Numbers don't care how you feel, and if you blur them even playfully, you risk building a financial life on illusion. 2 lecterns, no slides, no safety net. And you can feel it already. The room is leaning forward. Vivian begins calm, almost conversational. She doesn't start with math, she starts with access. She points out that for decades, personal finance has been packaged like a gated community. Acronyms, spreadsheets, judgment. If you didn't already understand it, you weren't invited in. And so millions of people, especially young people, especially women, opted out before they ever began. Her argument is that trends like girl math are not distortions, they are translations. If someone reframes a purchase as cost per wear or cost per hour of joy, what they're actually doing is engaging with trade-offs for the first time. They're assigning value. They're thinking in ratios instead of absolutes. And that matters, because a 22-year-old who jokes their way into tracking spending is still tracking spending. A joke that leads to awareness is not a bug. It's the entry point. You can feel a few heads nodding in the room. She presses further. Loud budgeting, she argues, is even more powerful, not because it changes math, but because it changes social pressure. For years, the default script was quiet overspending, keeping up, but silently. Shame lived in the background. Now, people are saying out loud, I can't go to dinner, I'm saving. And suddenly, restraint isn't embarrassing, it's visible, it's normalized. Her core claim lands clean. If you want better financial outcomes, you don't just change the spreadsheet, you change the psychology that feeds it. There's a pause, not applause, but attention. Bernadette Joy steps forward and the energy shifts. She doesn't reject the premise. In fact, she nods to it. Yes, finance has been exclusionary. Yes, behavior matters. Yes, people need on-ramps. But then she pivots and you can feel the room tighten. Because her question is sharper. What happens when the on-ramp becomes the destination? She takes aim directly at girl math. Her argument is not that it's silly, it's that it's dangerous, precisely because it feels harmless. Because when you justify spending through reframing, cost per wear, emotional ROI, you are still spending. And eventually the bill arrives. Not emotionally, mathematically. She calls it a form of cognitive dissonance, a way to hold two conflicting ideas at once. I'm being responsible, and I'm increasing my obligations. And when those collide, when the credit card statement lands, what follows isn't empowerment. It's shame. Deeper than before, because now you thought you were doing it right. There's a murmur in the room. That one lands. She doesn't stop there. On loud budgeting, she agrees with the intent but questions the execution, saying, I'm saving money is not the same as having a system that ensures you are. Vocalizing restraint without structure is performance, and performance doesn't pay down debt. Her core argument is blunt. Finance should be simple, not cute, not viral. Simple. Spend less than you earn, invest the difference. Repeat long enough and the system works. Anything that distracts from that risks turning a lifelong discipline into a temporary trend. The room is quiet now, not divided, just thinking. Vivian returns, and this is where the debate sharpens. She doesn't deny the math. She reframes the premise. The real risk, she argues, is not that people misunderstand math. It's that they never engage with it at all. Perfection is a high bar, too high for most people to start. If girl math gets someone to look at their bank account, if loud budgeting helps someone say no for the first time, those are behavioral breakthroughs, and behavior precedes optimization. You don't start with perfect systems, you start with participation. And here's her knockout. Delivered softly, but you can feel it ripple. Rigid frameworks often assume a level of discipline that people don't yet have. And when people inevitably fail those frameworks, they don't adjust, they quit. So the question isn't whether these trends are mathematically perfect. It's whether they are directionally better than disengagement. That one rattles the room. Bernadette doesn't flinch. She acknowledges the point explicitly. Yes, engagement matters. Yes, starting messy is better than not starting. But then she tightens the lens. Because direction matters, but so does trajectory. If your starting point builds habits that normalize justification, that blur trade-offs, that treat spending as something to be rationalized instead of constrained, then you're not just starting messy. You're building the wrong instincts. And those instincts compound just as powerfully as money does. Her critique lands clean. You don't need perfection to start, but you do need clarity. And clarity requires calling things what they are. Spending is spending, debt is debt, math is math. The tension is fully alive now. And then something rare happens. Vivian concedes a weakness. She acknowledges that these trends can drift, that what starts as a bridge can become a crutch, that without progression, without eventually confronting the full math, people can stall in a comfortable but incomplete version of financial literacy. Bernadette, in turn, concedes hers. She admits that strict systems can alienate, that not everyone responds to discipline first, that for many people, especially those historically excluded, the emotional relationship with money has to heal before the numbers can take hold. And in that moment, the debate stops being oppositional. It becomes layered, because what's emerging isn't a clean answer, it's a sequence. Psychology gets you in the game. Math keeps you there. Too much softness and you drift, too much rigidity and you never start. The audience isn't clapping, they're sitting with it, because you can feel the real question underneath the question. Not whether these trends are good or bad, but where they belong in the life cycle of someone trying to build a financial life. Are they the spark or the system? And maybe the discomfort is that they're being asked to be both. I look out at the room and you can see it. People running their own balance sheets in their heads, not of money, of behavior. Where they started, what worked, what didn't. Because this isn't really about girl math or loud budgeting. It's about the quiet negotiation between who we are and what the numbers demand. And that negotiation doesn't resolve cleanly. It evolves. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. Roland Henry White didn't set out to reshape early automobiles or heavy machinery. He started where precision lived, in his father's sewing machine factory in Cleveland. It was the kind of place that taught mechanical sympathy, how small inefficiencies compound, how overlooked details turn into catastrophic failures under load. That environment shaped a mind that hated waste and respected systems. At the turn of the 20th century, transportation was clearly breaking. Horses choked cities and limited scale. The future had to be mechanical, but the path was contested. Gasoline engines felt loud, finicky, and unproven. Steam carried the comfort of familiarity. It powered trains and factories, but it came with a deadly flaw. Steam cars were dangerous in a very literal sense. Boilers stored massive volumes of pressurized water and heat. Build pressure for speed, and you sat atop a potential bomb. Most engineers saw the trade-off and tried to manage it. Thicker walls, bigger reservoirs, more safeguards. Incremental thinking wrapped around an uncomfortable constraint. White looked at the same problem and decided the constraint itself was flawed. He didn't reinforce the old boiler. He made the massive stored pressure reservoir unnecessary. His flash boiler sent water through stacked coils where it flashed into steam on demand. No giant reservoir waiting to explode. Water flowed only when pumped. Steam came from the coil closest to the fire, delivering superheated power with far greater safety and responsiveness. The result was elegant: quicker startup, better control, and enough performance that White steamers earned real respect. They won competitions, set speed records, and took home a gold medal at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition for a compound high and low pressure engine. For a moment, they stood competitive in a skeptical market. But the flash boiler wasn't the end of the story. It was the pattern. White wasn't married to steam. He was married to solving the real bottleneck. When gasoline engines improved and the ecosystem shifted against steam cars, fueling stations, infrastructure, simplicity, he walked away without nostalgia. Most inventors fall in love with their first solution. White followed the problem. By the 1910s, he saw a new constraint in agriculture and rough terrain. Wheeled tractors bogged down in soft soil. Weight concentrated at 4 points tore the ground and limited usefulness exactly where machines were needed most. Conventional thinking chased bigger wheels or more power. White reframed it as a relationship between machine and earth. He turned to crawler tractors, founding the Cleveland Motor Plow Company, later Cletrac. Tracks distributed weight and maintained continuous contact. The machine no longer fought the ground, it adapted to it. But tracks brought their own problem: turning. Early systems slowed or braked one track, sacrificing power, traction, and control. In mud or on a slope with a load, that clumsiness could stall progress or damage equipment. Precision mattered in farming as much as raw power. White's answer was controlled differential steering. Instead of brute braking one side, the system intelligently varied speed between tracks while keeping drive and power flowing to both. Smooth, powerful turns without jerking or loss of momentum. He layered in supporting innovations: an elevated drive sprocket to reduce wear, a unique bead chain track system, a double drive socket, and an oil pump for continuous lubrication of the bottom rollers. Cletrac tractors became known as strong, durable, and genuinely maneuverable. Many survive today, still working on farms and job sites. The core idea of controlled differential steering continues in some modern crawler designs. Here's where the pattern propagates sideways. White thought he was building better farm equipment, a productivity tool for moving through mud and turning cleanly under load. But robust systems rarely stay confined to their first context. When World War II arrived, the U.S. Army needed tracked vehicles, tanks and high-speed tractors that could maintain traction and maneuver effectively across unpredictable terrain. White's controlled differential was adopted widely. It made American tanks more agile and easier to operate by delivering power to both tracks during turns, rather than relying solely on braking one side. A sewing machine, factory air, solving a steam safety problem, then a farming mobility problem, quietly gave mechanized forces a practical edge in how machines turned under pressure. That's the deeper lesson in Rollin White's career. Innovation isn't always about picking the winning technology of the moment. It's about identifying the hidden assumption: stored pressure, concentrated weight, brute force steering, and removing it. Rebuild around what the system actually requires. He filed his 100th patent in 1933. By then, he had shown a repeatable playbook: find the real constraint, eliminate the unnecessary, stack complementary improvements, and let the solution travel wherever the next problem demands. Most innovation today chases optimization inside existing paradigms: faster, cheaper, slightly better. White's story is a reminder that the highest leverage moves often come from questioning whether the paradigm should exist at all. What if the bottleneck you're managing is actually optional? What if the niche fix you're building today becomes the foundation for something far larger tomorrow? Rollin Henry White never designed a tank. He never set out to influence warfare. He simply built excellent, thoughtful machines that solved real problems so cleanly their ideas outlived their original markets. And that may be the truest measure of durable innovation. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc from systems to signal, psychology to structure, fragments to full picture. The pattern was simple: see clearly, stack carefully, stress test constantly. Because first principles aren't flashy, but they're often where the future first flickers into focus.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Until next time, stay curious
Stay kind.
and keep compounding.